Hello, and welcome to Leeds Echoes. In this series, I'll be exploring different aspects of Leeds' rich history. Each episode, I'll tell a different story, whether it's a particular building, an entire industry, a lost transportation network. But most importantly, I want to try and figure out how the people that lived and breathed this history felt. What did the local butcher think? Or your neighbour? What did the city sound like? And what did it smell like? These are the kind of things I really want to explore in this series, and I'm really excited where the journey's going to take me. Hopefully I'll see some of you on the way. There are a lot of people talking about the police at the moment. Whether it's for or against them, to defund or not, whether we could live without them. Now, regardless of your answer to these questions, I think it's important to understand where the police as we know it came from. How narratives and opinions that feel timeless are in fact quite new, and how some other narratives and opinions we think of as quite new are actually remarkably timeless. History will always resist simplicity. '18th century Leeds, much like the rest of 18th century, mostly rural England, had no police force. What they did have was the law. And prior to the existence of organised policing, it was the victim who was centre stage in enforcing the law. It was said that once subjected to a crime, a victim often became his own policeman and solicitor. And recent research has shown that many working class men represented themselves in legal proceedings over the 18th century, that the discretion was ultimately in their hands as to how justice should be pursued. The threat and deterrent to any would-be criminals being the wide arsenal of laws the victim had at their disposal, many of them resulting in execution. Local legislation over the 18th century, such as the 1755 Act establishing the Improvement Commission, focused on things like street lighting, urban regulations around street sweeping, and the slaughter of animals. Disputes were settled locally, often outside of the justice system. It was a local act of Leeds Parliament in 1815 which established what we'd see now as a police force. An act to amend and enlarge the powers and provisions of an Act of His Present Majesty for erecting a courthouse and prison for the borough of Leeds, in the county of York, to provide for the expense of the prosecution of felons in certain cases, and to establish a police and nightly watch in the town, borough, and neighbourhood of Leeds. And so the Night Watch was born, a group of local men who patrolled the city at night. Crime was perniciously nocturnal. Even then as now, it could be debated whose interests in society were truly at the heart of expanding the police. In February of 1833, the mayor, Thomas Tennant, was robbed on Bank Street just off Boar Lane at dusk. Whilst alone, he was grabbed from behind, hands covering his eyes and mouth, and pulled backwards towards the floor. Two other sets of hands began fishing through his pockets, and a fourth assailant had already made away with his portable writing desk, containing a considerable amount of banknotes and coins. Now, soon after this, additional watch patrols were deployed on the streets of Leeds. 3 years later, by 1836, the Watch Committee had been established, and a decision was made to amalgamate the day and night watches into a combined force, Leeds City Police. The force grew gradually over the 19th century, facing controversy and opposition along the way. Most of the out-of-town boroughs like Armley and Bramley said they saw no need to expand the police into their townships, balking at the potential financial cost. It was only Headingley which put in repeated requests to have coverage from the day and night watches. likely due to it being by far the wealthiest satellite borough, home to many of Leeds' rich and powerful elite. There were allegations of corruption and incompetence too. Before the appointment of two dedicated barristers to prosecute offences in Leeds courts, policemen were frequently accused of profiteering from abusing the chaos in the system. And records from the Watch Committee highlight frequent and systemic abuses of power and misconduct from officers of all ranks. By the latter half of the 19th century, the Watch Committee was regularly handing cases of misconduct back to chief constables for them to deal with directly. Therefore, behind the statistics, which are illuminating enough in themselves, is the dark shadow of the unreported and undocumented transgressions. There is one particular recurring theme at the heart of most misconduct, not only in the 19th century but the 20th as well: the drunken policeman. Alcohol lay at the heart of up to 40% of cases investigated by the Watch Committee. It is incredibly difficult to make any easy conclusions over how effective the police's gradual introduction was in terms of its impact on crime. Huge inconsistencies in reporting make any analysis challenging. It's probably easier to argue that the police's predominant success was in reshaping and enforcing order to this new urban environment. Despite there not being any cars, Leeds City Police spent a lot of time enforcing traffic regulations, sometimes to the dismay of local residents who had been in the habit of these behaviours unchecked for years. Carts and wagons left in the street, overcrowded tramcars. 1868 even saw an influx of complaints regarding washing lines being hung across ever busier streets. It seems as though people began to stop settling their disputes amongst themselves and instead involve the police. And whilst it's true that the Leeds of 1868 was often changing around its citizens far quicker than they could adjust to, and that such enforcements were required to pave the way of progress, I can't escape the idea that today, in 2020, are we so detached from our neighbours and so unwilling to enter into difficult conversations with them because we can have the police do it for us instead? I'm sure this part of Leeds City Police's history is much like any other in the UK. The decades required to birth an organisation such as we know it into life, gradually transforming a ragtag group of locals into a professional organisation with its own methods, practices, and officers who were experienced in them. And gradually the public came to accept and even embrace their presence. Well, mostly. In researching for this episode, I've come across some pretty astounding cases of the public turning on the police. On the 5th of November, bonfire night of 1949, after a match at Elland Road, a large group of Sheffield Wednesday fans began causing trouble at Leeds Market, trashing barrows and starting fires. A group of 200 strong men and women then descended on Millgarth Police Station in an attempt to overrun it and free its prisoners. Now, somehow, the hardened officers of Millgarth Station, led by Superintendent Herbert Galt, who himself was an ex-officer from the First World War, managed to hold the mob back. And by the late 1960s, Leeds City Police was near collapsing under the weight of its own bad reputation. A seemingly never-ending string of its own officers were convicted of a litany of offences over the turbulent decade, and numerous cover-ups were exposed. Leeds City Police and local government was so deep down the rabbit hole of denial that openly addressing its issues through proper reform felt almost impossible. On Christmas Eve, 1969, a Leeds City Police superintendent named Derek Holmes was driving an unmarked police car along the A660 Otley Road, heading out of town towards Headingley, when he struck and killed a pedestrian, Minnie Wine, on the crossing in front of the Skyrack pub. Two young Leeds City Police constables were first on the scene. They found Superintendent Holmes out of his vehicle, stood motionless, staring at the elderly woman's body he had just hit. The two constables smelt alcohol on the superintendent's breath, and they believed him to be drunk. Two senior officers then arrived on scene, one an inspector and one a sergeant. And just 8 months after the death of David Olawale, but before any investigation had begun, it was no other than Inspector Geoffrey Elliker who arrived outside the Skyrack pub that Christmas Eve. The two constables who had been first to arrive immediately attempted to raise their concerns with Elliker and the sergeant who had just arrived. And it is worth bearing in mind that Elliker was an alcoholic himself, who regularly drank heavily whilst on shift. The two constables protested that the driver, Superintendent Holmes, should be breathalyzed. The sergeant, John Nicholson, refused and ordered them to resume their patrol duties. The sergeant then assumed control of the investigation, but failed to make markings and measurements, didn't send for a photographer, and failed to have the car examined until the following morning. The narrative on scene was even changed to suggest that Minnie Wine, the pedestrian who was tragically hit and killed, smelt of drink herself. Now, not only is this a disgusting abuse of power, but laughably unlikely. Poor Minnie Wine, who was on her way home from an evening bingo session, was a lifelong teetotaler. And then, over the following weeks, the two constables claimed that the chief superintendent of Leeds City Police's traffic division, Harry Royston, repeatedly summoned them into his office to alter their statements. And in the court case that ensued, the chief superintendent admitted under questioning to altering the statements made by both officers, deleting the passage suggesting that the driver, Holmes, smelt of drink and should be breath tested. Now, despite this, he was found not guilty of all charges brought against him. In fact, of the 4 officers in court over the alleged cover-up, only Elliker and Sergeant Nicholson were convicted. And within months, Elliker was on trial again, this time over the death of David Olawale. Another trial in which Leeds Assizes Court openly attempted to protect its officers at all costs. Now, just to get a scale of the sense of potential corruption that was going on, the judge presiding over the Olawale case, mere months after the corruption case of the death of Minnie Wine, was none other than Justice Hinchcliffe, who, on Christmas Eve of 1969, is said to have also been in the car with Superintendent Holmes when they struck and killed Miss Wine, that they were both travelling together to the Masonic Lodge just a few hundred metres further up Otley Road. That's still a Freemasons lodge today, the Lodge of Dawn 6511. In fact, even a former boss of mine is a current senior member. Leeds can be a very small place when it wants to be. Justice Hinchcliffe was then allegedly swept away from the scene before many people noticed. Now, as I mentioned in my last episode, Leeds City Police's reputation was no secret. The scandal encompassing it was so great that the Home Secretary of the time was at one point even considering taking direct control of the force, a move unprecedented in British history. Instead, Leeds City Police suffered a much more reputationally manageable fate. It was merged with Bradford City Police and the wider West Riding Force to create the West Yorkshire Metropolitan Police Force. And that's who we still have today, minus the Metropolitan bit. And the corruption? Well, I'll leave you to go and research that yourself. But given that this is the force which ultimately shielded Jimmy Savile for decades, which has supplied heroin and prostitutes to an informant, and had an alarming number of officers convicted of various charges relating to paedophilia over the last 10 years, despite repeated efforts to suppress them, I feel like you might find something. Now, Millgarth Police Station may be long gone, but the ghosts once trapped within its walls, the spectre of corrupt policing, still haunts Leeds today. Thank you so much for listening to another episode of Leeds Echoes. If you enjoyed it, let me know, and hopefully there'll be some more soon. Stay safe, take care, and defund the police.